The story so far: Darth Vader is still Luke's father. That was quite confronting. Bruce Wayne is still Batman, and everyone kind of knows it, but we humour him by pretending it's still some kind of secret. Iron Man dies at the end, and Sigourney Weaver remains the world's most authentically kick-ass alien slayer ever. In other news, one of you has just called me out for failing allegedly to understand the purported true strength of car alleged expert's hilarious but fatally flawed fling with a dynamometer trailer and the BYD Shark 6 plug-in hybrid ute. This video is therefore rated BKP for bare knuckle physics and PBBD for probable brain bleed. Dude. Don't say I never warned you. So, crank up the village people and slip on those New Year fishnets a little early. We're going in. I'm John Cadogan from AutoExpert.com.au. New cars, cheap, but Australia only. Website. Code. Here's the criticism, but just for context, okay? Car alleged expert stuck a controlled 3 kilonewton dynamometer load behind the Shark 6 with a fairly depleted battery, and although it squirted straight up to 100 k's an hour, it relatively quickly limped back to 70, whence it remained running mainly on dinosaur juice via the front transaxle. I know crude oil is plankton, dude, like geologically modified plankton. Depending on who you ask, this test result was either, no big deal, or kind of more like the second coming of Jesus, only to discover Jesus is actually Ronald McDonald. I did a whole video on that. The test, dude, not Ronald McDonald Jesus. I'm still working on that one. A link to my earlier vid and the source car alleged expert video in the description should you wish to detain yourself there and get up to speed. Greatly appreciate your video and gave it a like. Concur with your observation regarding the unrealistic nature of the testing procedures demonstrated in the car expert video. However, believe there is an important consideration you may have overlooked. This particular test was conducted across multiple vehicle models, not exclusively on the BYD. The results showed varying levels of performance across different vehicles, with some failing to meet the criteria while others demonstrated satisfactory performance. The Snero 3 there, and all agreed so far, dude. Car alleged expert has been very keen indeed on driving a range of vehicles with a 3 kilonewton dynamometer trailer hung out the back of said vehicles' anuses. Ani, whatever. I think it's Latin. The value of this testing lies in its consistency as a comparative tool despite its limitations in replicating real-world conditions. To illustrate this point, can share more personal experience. More current vehicle MUX did not meet the test requirements, whereas more previous vehicle Patrol exceeded expectations significantly. While I acknowledge the testing methodology has its flaws, particularly regarding aspects such as battery charge level management, its primary merit lies in providing a standardised basis for comparison across different vehicles. Okay, so what he's talking about there is experimental control, like benchmarking. The bare-knuckle physics of which really is that you run a mad experiment, you keep everything the same except for one thing, the variable. The same everything else bit is the control, which is kind of an important science concept. Same flat track, same speed, 100, same dyno load, 3 kilonewtons. You just change the vehicle, right? How hard can it be? You see which ones shine and which ones poop in their duds. Except this car alleged expert test is not an example of that. It's not relatable to the real world at all when you think about it like a grown-up. It's not a good comparative benchmark at all. It is absolutely the same dyno load on the same flat track at the same speed all day long. And yet, it's also meaningless bullshit. Amusing, engaging, meaningless bullshit. Uplifting, meaningless bullshit. Personal opinion, of course. Can you see why? I'll explain it next, but you might bleed from the ears with that bit. So Tampax up now, dude. This report is sponsored by NordVPN. Get a huge discount plus 4 extra months of Nord for free right now in Nord's Black Friday exclusive deal. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC. Online security threats are, of course, everywhere, but you do not have to be the next victim. And that's where NordVPN comes in, locking everything down efficiently in the background. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now. Every 2-year NordVPN plan receives a huge discount plus 4 bonus months on top. nordvpn.com/AEJC. Link in the description. Using NordVPN is dead easy. You just subscribe, download the app, and you connect. 1 click later, your IP address is shielded and your traffic is encrypted across as many as 6 of your devices. Nord is, of course, the fastest VPN on the planet. It costs only about as much as 1 cup of coffee every month to keep your data, your identity, and your devices secure. Masking your location means you'll be able to access streaming and other services that might be blocked where you live, plus you can continue to watch your favourite content when you travel. Go to nordvpn.com/AEJC now, boost your security, get that huge discount, and enjoy those extra 4 months completely free on every 2-year plan. It's all totally risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/AEJC, link in the description. Okay, so let's talk about you. You know I love you in that trousers on platonic way. I know that you want an awesome tow platform so you can hook up your 3.5-ton road cockroach and take a dump in the shower in the middle of the kitchen floor with friends on the club lounge at the foreshore of Dingo Piss Creek with like-minded bogan imbeciles, which appears to be the sole attraction of caravanning insofar as I can tell. Nothing wrong with that. Living the dream. Unfortunately, I'm going to be busy that day, dude. Caravans, right? The arterial plaque of the open road. Gotta love them. You've got all of these vehicles to choose from, haven't you? It's a proper smorgasbord out there, and they all weigh different amounts. They all have varying tow capacity limits, and they all come with varying gross combination mass limits. If you load them all up to the GCM, the gross combination mass, and you punt them all up some highway hill, physics says gravity pushes against all the combinations differently, like resists them, pushes them back down the hill. If the gradient of the hill is fixed, which it is in reality, the gravity resistance which the powertrain fights against is going to depend only on the mass of the combination. And yet, car-alleged expert sticks the same dyno load behind them all. Which is kind of the opposite of a meaningful experiment when you think about it. It's like changing the gradient every time and then comparing the vehicles. The point is, you want to know how different vehicles perform when you load them up to their GCM on particular challenging hills at relevant speeds, right? The further point is, I would argue, and Isaac Newton agrees, incidentally, the car-alleged expert test cannot tell you that. It's just kind of meaningless fun with cool toys on a test track to entertain people with vestigial room temperature IQs in degrees C who only ever thought about boobies and football as they floated with neutral buoyancy through the education system. You don't want the load imposed by the dyno, which incidentally is a proxy for gravity on a hill, to be the same every time. You really don't. You want it to vary in line with the GCM so they're all faced with the same challenge of dragging their sorry GCM asses up a particular hill, a relevant hill, an experimental control hill. And this is the bit they missed out on. Personal opinion. And I say this because that's what you're going to do in reality, right? That's what you want to know before you buy the vehicle and the van. Like, you want to know how it's going to cope with reality, that steep hill that's out there in the terrain, in reality. And unless your dream is to tow a dyno trailer on the flat at 3 kilonewtons and 100 k's an hour, the car alleged expert test is entirely unhelpful, I would argue. To illustrate this, I made a list of popular tow vehicles and then I stuck them in order of lightest to heaviest GCM. The Ranger Raptor is the lightest with a 5,370 kilo GCM. The outgoing Patrol is the heaviest with 7 tons GCM even. All these data that you're looking at come from redbook.com.au, the GCM data that is. Then what I did was I converted the GCMs to kilonewtons because the trailer is rated in kilonewtons, like the dynamometer. And to do that, you just multiply by 9.81 roughly and divide by 1,000. And this next bit, I suppose, is kind of interesting because you have to decide what road gradients actually matter to you for the purpose of assessment. For standards compliance, a 12% slope is quite often used. This is a very severe highway slope, and civil engineering standards generally require speed limitation to something like 60 k's an hour on roads of that gradient, mainly to expand the control envelope of the vehicle and minimise the speed disparity between light and heavy vehicles sharing the same piece of road. There's a homologation requirement, like a vehicle compliance standard, in some markets at least, that light vehicles be able to perform 5 hill starts in 5 minutes on a 12% slope. And there's another homologation requirement that the parking brakes hold a vehicle securely loaded to its GCM on a high traction 12% slope. In other words, 12% is a standardised severe slope which has been selected by brainiacs well above my pay grade for various aspects of GCM performance compliance because it's an extreme but relevant slope test. This leads to inevitable artefacts in some owners' manuals and brochures, such as limitation for towing not to exceed 12% gradients at times. That's in the BYD Shark 6 manual, which car-alleged expert seems to think is borderline third-rate performance, but it's actually quite common because it's based on a certification standard kind of test. You remember most probably the previous generation Amarok V6, right? Nobody I know ever regarded that vehicle as some kind of underpowered pig. Quite the opposite. It had some stick, that vehicle. But if you look here at the Emission Cheaters PDF brochure for that very ute, buried right down the back inside the text specs, you'll see one of those little fine print disclaimers imposing exactly the same 12% gradient maximum for towing on that car. This is not a coincidence. I suspect that if you took your excess spare time, you could probably find quite a few more examples just like this. 12% is a compliance maximum. So maybe it makes sense to see how competently all vehicles can take off when you load them to their GCM on a 12% gradient. Multiple times, back to back, up to 60 k's an hour, and stop and do it again. Repeat, which is going to be the limit on most extended 12% slopes on highways in Australia, right? Unfortunately, if you wanted to run that test, you'd need to change the dyno trailer setting for every vehicle, wouldn't you? This next column in my table here shows exactly what resistive loads you would need to apply. The gravity resistance for the Raptor with its 5.37 tonne GCM is 6.3 kilonewtons. For the Patrol with a 7 tonne GCM, it's 8.2 kilonewtons. This is kind of a substantial variation of ballpark 30%. for exactly the same gradient is proportional, right? Every tonne of GCM carries with it a 1.17 kilonewton gravity resistance penalty on a 12% slope. This is very easy to dial in if you're using a computerised dyno trailer, which Car Alleged Expert is. So it's got me kind of fucked why they seemingly couldn't be asked to do this comparatively simple analysis, given they already had the cool toys out on the track, because that would be a very useful and interesting experiment to run. Kind of useful to people actually buying these vehicles so they can take a dump at the head of the table in iconic World Heritage listed busted ass cattle scrub destinations across the nation. You know, dude, people like you. The other elephant in the room here is fuel economy and endurance on heavy but kind of common highway gradients at touring speeds, say 100 k's an hour. This page here, okay, it's from Ostroad's Guide to Road Design Part 3, Geometric Design, Miracle Insomnia Cure, right there. Table 8.3, mountainous terrain, 100k limit, general maximum recommended gradient on primary highways, 6% gradient. So if you wanted to run a mad but meaningful experiment on that, you would dial in the resistive load to simulate a 6% gradient on the dyno for every vehicle. It varies from 3.2 kilonewtons for the Raptor at GCM to 4.1 kilonewtons for the Patrol at its GCM. Perhaps you could run it for 5 minutes and 100 k's per and measure the fuel consumption and note any performance glitches. And also, you got to note that doing this with the Shark 6 would require 3.4 kilonewtons of dyno trailer load, which would have exhausted the battery even quicker than the test which they did at 3 kilonewtons. But I think they hobbled the vehicle there by bringing it to the party with the battery more or less pre-depleted. It would have been fairer, in my view, to run one test commencing with the battery at, I don't know, let's say 80% and one at the preset limit for V2L exhaustion at 25% SOC. That'd make sense. Doing that would have added a lot of context and value, at least in my view. And again, this test is dead easy to dial in on a computerized dyno trailer. It's just 0.587 kilonewtons, of resistance for every tonne of GCM on a 6% slope. This is very basic computational stuff, right? Now, I get the Snero 3's point about 3 kilonewtons being some point of consistency, like a benchmark, every vehicle pulling the same load on the dyno trailer. But it's meaningless in the real world when you think about it, where the hills on any particular set of roads are the control. If the road is an experiment, the terrain is the control. The gradients are the control, right? This far right column on my table shows the slope that 3 kilonewtons represents in percent to the vehicle loaded at GCM, right? With 3 kilonewtons of gravity resistance, which is the dyno trailer is a proxy for. The dyno trailer represents a hill, and therefore you can take your test combination anywhere, dial in the hill on the flat, and then have a crack and see how it goes. This is the same geometry assessment throughout, right? I just kind of flipped it at the end. In the first bit, I fixed the slopes at 12 and 6% respectively for the reasons I gave, and I calculated the gravity resistance that you'd need to dial in. In this latter bit, the gravity resistance, like the trailer dynamometer proxy, is 3 kilonewtons because that was Car Alleged Expert's test, and I just computed the equivalent slope that represents for every vehicle at its GCM. It's very basic applied trigonometry, right? 3 kilonewtons represents a 5.7% slope for the Raptor with the lightest GCM in this particular field, and a 4.4% slope for the Patrol with the heaviest GCM. Effectively, using a 3 kilonewton constant load is the same thing as testing fully laden vehicle combinations on different gradients. This is the opposite of experimental control, or at least benchmarking, right? It doesn't give you meaningful information on vehicle performance in the real world, where the terrain is the control and the variable is the vehicle you choose to buy and drive through it when you are heavily laden, meaning the all-up mass and the gravity resistance that terrain represents, okay? In the car alleged expert test, 3 kilonewtons would represent a 28% variation in the equivalent test gradient across the field of those vehicles in my list. 28%. This is the opposite of a valid, meaningful experiment. It's the Jaguar rebrand of toe tests. Personal opinion. Like, dude, I look at it and I go, yeah, but what the fuck does it actually tell you? Okay? Why am I explaining this right now? I get the Snero 3's point. Superficially, it looks like the car alleged expert test is well controlled and it appears to benchmark vehicle performance in some way. And it does, I guess. But the only way I can see is if you're towing a 3 kilonewton dyno trailer on the flat at 100 k's an hour, which doesn't translate to driving through reality across vehicles with different GCMs, does it? It just doesn't. So I want you to get that in perspective when you look at their test, because so many people buy these shit heaps with the intention of hooking up maximum road cockroach so they can take a dump in the kitchen over bacon and eggs with guests in remote places. And 3 kilonewtons is simply not an apples for apples way to assess comparative on-road performance between different vehicles on the same hills. It's just not. Secondly, to car alleged expert, I would suggest that they've got the cool toys, right? They've got access to the dyno trailer and the track, and that is cool. And they've got the inclination to actually test this shit. Wait till you're my age and you've stood on the side of tracks endlessly doing handling tests and tyre tests and all of that stuff. Do you want to do it much more? Not so much. The thing I think they're missing here is quite simply, it really doesn't cost any more to do a truly meaningful experiment for actual people in the market for a new vehicle. So why not just change up and do that?